Good evening and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right into our first Jewish Destiny series of the year. So tonight's topic is the Holocaust. And there's really nothing we could say about the Holocaust, and anything that we do say to a certain extent only minimizes it, because it is still an impossible event for us to understand, even with now more than almost 80 years distance from it. It's still very hard to comprehend how we could have a modern westernized country like Germany become a genocidal government and a genocidal country and really almost succeed in eradicating European Jewry. But it is a very important historical event, and definitely is really the culmination of almost everything we've been talking about in many of the sessions since the beginning of the Destiny series, for sure since the rise of Christianity, because the Holocaust was really the culmination of the Christian anti-Semitism that had really festered and been fostered since Constantine on in the 4th century and on through there, having certain tremendous steps forward, like during the Crusades and the Khmelnytsky massacres, but that all definitely culminates in the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is not possible in a vacuum. It's not just the crazy whim of Hitler. It was all of European Jewry really taking part through the latent anti-Semitism that had come to the surface, and like we said, almost saw the eradication of European Jewry. Now, Hitler and the Nazis blamed all the world's problems on the Jews, the ultimate scapegoat, and really, to that extent, wanted to completely eradicate the Jews from Europe. Now, if we look at Europe before the war, there were almost 10 million Jews throughout all of Europe, and by the end of the war, there's less than 4 million. So 2/3, 60% of European Jewry is going to be completely eradicated through the Holocaust. Now, different countries, for different reasons, are going to fare better and for worse based on their proximity to the Nazis, based on certain internal affairs. Like, for example, Italy, who was really the first ally of the Nazis. Well, Mussolini will never really be into the idea of the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazis, so the Jews in Italy are going to fare much better than in many other countries. Whereas we'll have countries like Poland and Hungary, where almost the entirety of the Jewish population will be eradicated. So it'll really just depend on certain facts on the ground, and we'll touch on some of those facts as we go through tonight's session. So when the Germans came to power, it's a debate as to when the concept of the final solution actually came about. There are those who look to certain lines in Mein Kampf, which was produced before Hitler ever came to power in the 1920s, which show that Hitler was more than willing to exterminate European Jewry. But definitely in the early years and the Nazi rise to power before World War, or the early years of the Nazis in power before World War II, the goal was just to get rid of the Jews from Germany, and then subsequently the lands that Germany annexed, conquered, and had diplomatic relationships with, etc. So by 1938, we saw a situation where half of German Jews had left Germany. My grandfather included, left in 1937 from Germany to America. But over half had left, because that was really the goal, to get rid of them. And while the Germans didn't exactly make it easy, it was still possible in those days. Now, the Germans did discuss many plans to try and get rid of the Jews. There was even certain discussions with the Zionist movement. Now, the British weren't very forthcoming with letting the Jews go to Israel, but there were definitely discussions, interactions with the Nazis and the Zionist movement at that time. So it seems definitely initially the plan was deportation. The original plan was deportation, and only when it was clear that there was nowhere in the world for the Jews to go, that's when the final solution came into place. America wasn't an option because of the immigration laws, the quota laws that existed in America. Israel wasn't an option because of the British immigration laws. And then there was one option that was, it's a debate how seriously it was discussed, but the idea of Madagascar, the island that at this time was controlled by the French, off the southern coast of Africa. And apparently, as early as 1938, Hermann Goering brought this up to the German cabinet as a real possibility. Now, the idea was that all the Jews of Europe would be taken to Madagascar, and the living conditions were terrible in Madagascar. So the idea is, okay, they'd number one, be killing two birds with one stone. They would be out of Europe, and then, many of them wouldn't even survive there, so it really would take care of the problem initially for Europe, and then ultimately for the whole world through the elimination of the Jewish people. Now, the plan was that first they had to conquer France because it was a French colony at that point, which they did very easily by 1940. And then they would conquer Britain, and they would use the British fleet. They would repurpose the British fleet to take the Jews of Europe to Madagascar, drop them off there, and let them fend for themselves. And the goal was to take the Jews at a rate of 1 million per year, and over the course of 10 years, they would be able to get all the Jews from Europe to Madagascar. And this was even included in the peace proposal that went to the Pope. Now, we haven't mentioned the Pope at all yet. Just parenthetically over here, the Pope basically came to an accommodation with the Nazis. They were, when we talk about Hitler's willing executioners, or the different people who either remained silent or didn't stand up or didn't do enough, the Pope and the Catholic Church were first and foremost on that list. But anyways, this Madagascar plan was included in that proposal to the Pope. The only problem is the British, right? The British would not succumb to the Nazis. They would never give up. Hitler was never able to, as we talked about last week, was never able to mount an invasion of Britain, and therefore Hitler never got the British fleet to be able to repurpose it into the shipping for the Madagascar plan. Now, most historians think that it was a very ambitious plan, but there was almost no scenario where it could become reality. But then again, that was the approach of the Nazis in general. People looked at Mein Kampf and thought it couldn't come to reality. Yet, so much of it did. So, really, by the onset of World War, on the onset of the war, there was nowhere for the Jews to go. And even though Hitler had a plan originally of just deporting the Jews and getting them out of Europe, well, he saw that there was nowhere for them to go. And we discussed last week the Evian Conference, where it was made very, very clear, and Hitler said it in no uncertain terms, that no one of the world wants the Jews, and therefore the plan came, okay, if we can't get rid of them through deportation, we're just going to have to exterminate them. Now, we saw that in Germany, this was the slow process before extermination, everything we talked about before, economic boycott, the Nuremberg laws, no police intervention, eventually Kristallnacht. And, the goal was really just to dehumanize the Jews completely, so that when the final solution came about, the Jew was already the same as if, I once heard the example, as if you or I would visit a Schlachthaus, a slaughterhouse for the first time, we might become vegetarians afterwards. But for the people who work there, they become desensitized to the fact that you start off with living animals and you are slaughtering the animals day in and day out. Well, that was the goal of the Germans throughout Europe, first in Germany, then throughout Europe, to totally dehumanize the Jews. So when it came time to actually execute the Jews, it would just be carrying out tasks, which was, of course, Eichmann's claim in his trial. And you look at some of these pictures. It's just it's so sad in so many ways, especially when we look at the Einsatzgruppen, the murder squad. You see these young SS officers, couldn't be more than 20, 22, 23 years old, completely young in looks and everything, and they're just holding off these guns, shooting these Jews, and that's what they were trained to do. So there are several dates we look at the start of the final solution. One is January 30th, 1939. This was the 6th anniversary of when the Nazis came to power. The Nazis came to power January 30th, 1933. So 6 years later, 1939. And something that was deemed the prophecy speech. Hitler spoke for 2.5 hours, laying out the policies of the Nazis on the onset of World War I. And in it, he made, in no uncertain terms, he made it clear that since they couldn't get rid of the Jews of Europe through deportation, it was going to have to happen through extermination. And it's hard for us to look beyond what is public record, because the Nazis always use innuendo, metaphor. But there is one conference known as the Wannsee Conference, which took place on January 20th, 1942, when a number of the leaders of the SS came together and to discuss the Jewish problem of Europe. And many historians believe it was at that conference where the actual plan for the final solution was laid out. Now, by this point, it was already well into the war. Poland had already been invaded and conquered. France had been invaded and conquered. Austria, Czechoslovakia, all part of Nazi Germany at this point. France and the extermination of Jews had already been put into place. But this is when it becomes systematic. It became systematic at this point. And the plan was that as Jews, as the Germans would take over the different areas of Europe, they would first go through a process of identifying the Jews. In many places, they would start with a ghetto. And the concept of a ghetto was to put the Jews all into one area where there wasn't sufficient shelter, food, sanitation, healthcare. So many would die just of hunger and disease. And there was a tremendous death rate in these ghettos. And just part of the cruelty of the Nazis is they established what was called the Judenrat. Now, the Judenrat was the Jewish council that in these ghettos, they would, the SS and the Nazis would be ultimately responsible for the ghettos, but they make Jewish councils in which the SS wouldn't deal directly with the Jews, they would deal through the Jewish council. So, for example, when it would come time for a selection, the SS wouldn't come into the ghetto and just have a selection. They would say to the Judenrat, tomorrow we need 2,000 Jews. And if you don't give us 2,000 Jews, we're going to exterminate the whole ghetto. So the Judenrat was caught between that rock and a hard place as to what they would do. Do they pick 2,000 Jews to try and save the other tens of thousands, or do they not? And there were definitely no winners in the situation of the Judenrat, and it was complete psychological warfare. And while there were those who were more benevolent than others, there's just no winners in the situation. One of the most famous of the Judenrat is, he probably never had the title Judenrat, but the similar concept was Rudolf Israel Kastner. Now, Rudolf Israel Kastner was a man who was accused of negotiating with Eichmann himself, and the facts that we know on the ground is that Kastner was able to save 1,684 Jews on what became known as the Kastner train, and he and his wife were able to immigrate to Israel, where they settled, became citizens, became civil servants. But after the war, there was a man by the name of Michael Grunwald who lobbied a campaign against Kastner. Now, he himself had 52 relatives. He was also a Hungarian Jew, and he had 52 relatives who were exterminated in Auschwitz, and therefore, through a number of pamphlets, he accused Kastner of collaborating with the Nazis, and eventually what happened was Kastner sued Grunwald for libel, and just in the way that Israel's civil cases work, the trial got turned around in a case where in the end, even though Grunwald was sued for libel, through the case, the Israeli government will find Kastner guilty of collaborating with the Nazis. And in his statement, the judge, Binyamin Halevi, who was the judge in the case, said that he made a deal with the devil, because the accusation was that Kastner knew about the liquidation of Hungarian Jewry before it happened. And the liquidation of Hungarian Jewry is one example. If anyone has any question in their head that the goal of the Nazis in waging war with the world was to exterminate Jewry, just look at Hungary. That here, it was 1944, the war was over, and you have all of Hungarian Jewry that is deported and most eventually exterminated after the war is over. And like, if you need it, the Germans had lost. And if you need any example that that's what the war was all about, just look at Hungarian Jewry. But the judge says that Kastner was guilty of making a deal with the devil, and he's initially found guilty. Now, at this point, Kastner becomes a recluse. His wife becomes depressed and can't get out of bed. And eventually, their children are spat on in the street and beat up at school. Now, 2 years later, Kastner is actually accosted by three men who shoot him 3 times, and he will die 15 days later of his wounds. Eventually, the Supreme Court of Israel will overturn the case, and there are other articles and documents that are declassified that come forward that essentially try to exonerate him. But history is oft to debate the case of Rudolf Kastner, if he was a hero, if he was in fact did make a deal with the devil. If he's a hero or a villain, It's just one of the complicated personalities of the time that really there were no winners, and it was just all part of the psychological warfare of the Nazis. Now, within the SS, there was the Einsatzgruppen, which was essentially the murder squad, and the goal was that after the Nazis would take over areas, the Einsatzgruppe would go in just to exterminate the Jews. Now, with the German efficiency, they realized that just initially the Einsatzgruppen would use just their machine guns and have mass shootings of Jews, force Jews to dig their graves and then shoot them, but that became very expensive and was not very efficient. So there were different attempts to see how to more efficiently exterminate the Jew. So one of the original methods was the extermination truck, which was a truck where there were diesel trucks, and the exhaust would be piped back into the truck, so that when people would be put in the truck, however many, 20 at a time or whatever it would be, they would turn on the truck and just run the truck until the people inside would die. But that also proved not to be a very efficient way to exterminate the Jews. So eventually there was a poison named Zyklon B. Zyklon was a pesticide, and it was perfected to be the drug of choice, if you will, for the Nazis through the death camps that were built 10 plus throughout all of Europe, and even in many of the concentration camps, there were still gas chambers and crematorium, because usually in many places the way that it would work is there would be a work camp alongside a death camp, and the infamous selections would take place. Anyone who would be fit to be able to work would be sent to the work camp and to be essentially worked to death, and those who couldn't work were sent to the death camps, where they were usually exterminated within a few hours. And that's why we talk about the famous Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a series of about 4 camps, but the main Auschwitz was a work camp, whereas Birkenau was the death camp. So the trains would be sent to Birkenau, people would be sent to the barracks, and often within a short period of time, they would be exterminated after arriving there. That's usually what happened at these places. Now, there were certain countries that came under the Nazi sphere of influence. We have to look at the King of Denmark, actually, and as much as there were different countries, Vichy France, we always come back to France over here, but Vichy France and Belgium, Norway, Sweden, all these different countries, where they came to certain accommodations to the Nazis. We see an example of the Kingdom of Denmark, where there was a real resistance put up against the Nazis that actually worked. And he really, the King Christian the 10th, really becomes really himself is the prosecutor of the rest of the European Jewry, because he proves that a certain amount of resistance to the Nazis actually did work. Now, truth be told, Denmark did not have a large Jewish population. There were only about 7,500 Jews in all of Denmark before the war, but 7,000 of those 7,500 are saved through as what happens initially is Denmark is part of the Nazi sphere of influence, but eventually later on in the war, the martial law is declared and the deportation of the Jews is ordered, but the people of the Denmark get together to help 7,000 out of 7,500 Jews to escape to Switzerland. Out of the 500, really about 476 that were captured, they're sent to Theresienstadt. And even after they were sent there, Theresienstadt was, by the way, that was a ghetto that was used when the Nazis had to put on a show for the world. They would use Theresienstadt. Now, Theresienstadt still had a gas chamber, still had a crematorium, but there were certain parts of the ghetto that could be used to stage propaganda to show that the Jews were really being treated okay throughout Nazi Germany, throughout Nazi Europe. But even when the 476 Jews of Denmark were sent to Theresienstadt, there was still an effort of the Danish people. They would send food. There would be checks from the Danish Red Cross. There would be real checks on the Danish citizens that were there. And in the end, only 52 Danish Jews will die in the Holocaust. So that's the accusation that's against the rest of European Jewry, that here King Christian X, put up a resistance, and definitely later in the war, when the Nazi effort to exterminate the Jews without willing hands at the hands of the government that they took over, he showed that resistance actually could work, and therefore, out of the 7,500 Jews of Denmark from before the war's numbers, only 52 are killed during the war. Now, we have the famous question that comes up, and that is to why the Allies didn't bomb Auschwitz, didn't bomb the tracks to Auschwitz, and there's even the new Kim Burns movie, which I've heard does a very good job of showing really the apathy of the American people as they found out about the Holocaust. As early as 1942, we have record of the American government already knowing about the Holocaust, and for sure by 1944, America had complete air supremacy over Europe, over the Nazi encampments, and they knew what was going on in Auschwitz. They knew what was going on. They knew what the railroad tracks were. And look, it's been a debate as to how feasible it would have been to take vital resources from the war effort and to bring them to bomb the tracks, to bomb Auschwitz, to bomb the gas chambers. And the argument for the Americans, in other words, the argument that America was justified, or the Allies were justified in not bombing, trying to stop Auschwitz, was that no one knew when the war was going to end. They thought they were days away, and yes, it took another year because of the fierce Nazi resistance. But who's to say it wouldn't? It wasn't just days away, and therefore the most, and this was really the at least the public opinion, public approach of Roosevelt, is the quicker that the war was brought to an end, the quicker the death camps would be shut down. And therefore, that's why Roosevelt claimed that all resources were used to end the war as opposed to trying to stop the death camps. On the flip side, now that we know how terrible the death camps were, and that America did have that information in hand, one day of shutting down Auschwitz would have saved tens of thousands of Jews and tens of thousands of others as well. So I think most historians err on the side of it being a tremendous mistake on the side of the Americans and the Allies to not have bombed or tried to stop the death camps in the midst of trying to shut down the Nazi war efforts. So when we look at Europe, when we look at the numbers, they're just staggering numbers. Like we said, there were about 10 million Jews in Europe before the war, and 60% of that is eradicated. Some countries worse than others. Really, it's almost in most cases, the earlier a country comes under the Nazi sphere of influence, the better the Jews fare because they have warning to get out. Again, Poland being the big exception to that. But Austria, that we know through the Anschluss, through diplomatic relations, became part of Germany. We see that about a quarter of their Jews, about a quarter to a third of their Jews were eradicated. Belgium had about 70,000 Jews before the war. 30,000 are killed. Moravia had 100,000 Jews. 80,000 are exterminated. Bulgaria had 50,000, of which 7,000 are exterminated. And we go on and on down the list. Estonia had 4,500, half of which are killed. France had 350,000, of which 1/3 are exterminated. We mentioned the numbers of Germany. Germany had about 500,000, of which not only, but 160,000 were killed. Greece had 77,000, almost completely eradicated. Hungary had 800,000, almost 600,000 eradicated. We mentioned the numbers of Italy. Italy had about 45,000, of which about 10,000 are exterminated. Latvia had 100,000, almost completely exterminated. Lithuania, 168,000, almost all exterminated. And on down the list. You had anywhere from 50 to 90% of most of European countries, the Jewish population was exterminated. Poland had over 3 million Jews. Before the war, over 3 million are exterminated. And, we throw around the number with the Holocaust of 6 million. Now, 6 million is based on the German records. The Germans kept very, very precise records, and their records were that they had records of about 6 million Jews being exterminated. Now, that meant in a systematic extermination that could be recorded. But when we really start to look at the numbers, it probably was far more than that. It probably was more like 7 or 8 million Jews are killed in the course of the war through, there's 6 million that we have record of from the Nazis, but a lot more than that we don't have record of. But like I started with, there's never enough words to explain the horrors of the Holocaust and the dark days of the Holocaust, and how it was really a culmination of decades, of really centuries of anti-Semitism. And let's face it, as much as this slogan that I frankly think is stupid has been touted ever since the Holocaust, or for many decades now of never again, I think it's silly. I think to say never again is not paying attention to the facts on the ground. I mean, let's look at Iran right now. We talked about Iran a little bit last week. If Iran was, or continues their goal of getting a nuclear weapon and does use it, then so much for never again. So I think it's really a foolish statement, never again, because it could happen again, and we just have to look at what's happening in the world. But to put a little bit of a more of a shkafik, a Jewish philosophical spin on it, when we talk about Mashiach and we talk about the Messianic era and we talk about the redemption of the Jewish people, it's clear in our prophets that there has to be some kind of showdown between the nations of the world and the Jewish people that will be a really catastrophic showdown. We'll read about it in the Yontiv of Sukkot. It's coming up in just a few days, and it's referred to in our prophets as the War of Gog and Magog. And according to many Jewish philosophers, the Holocaust was Gog and Magog. And we see a situation now where we're going to talk about in the coming weeks the founding of the modern state of Israel, the resettlement of Israel, the real resettlement of Israel, in which we have a situation today where I think in the recent census in Israel, there's 10 million people in Israel, of which about 7 million are Jews, which is more than half of the world Jewish population. And we have to think that we are somehow slowly but surely getting closer and closer and closer to the days of Mashiach, and it should only happen b'mheira v'yameinu amen, because that is the ultimate never again. The only way to guarantee a never again is to have the redemption of the Jewish people, with the Jewish people returning to Israel, with the Beis Hamikdash, the temple being rebuilt, and a reinstitution of the Davidic monarchy, with Mashiach Tzidkenu sitting on the throne. We should see it b'mheira v'yameinu. And as we're in these days of Yemei Ratzon, these days of the Aser Shemei Tshuva, we should really focus on that, because as we look at the davening and the tefillos of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur, obviously, we focus on our kapara and our slich, on our forgiveness, but the main amidah that we say on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the focus is on the geula, the focus is on the redemption. So there's no time right now to be focused on it. As we talk about these dark days, the destruction of European Jewry, let's focus, like we said last week, that now that has happened, we can really anticipate the geula to happen, and we should see it b'mheira v'yameinu amen. I thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a gemar chasima tova. Next week we will not have a session because it'll be the waning moments of Yom Kippur, and God willing, we will have a session during Chol Hamoed Sukkot. So I'll look forward to talking to you again in 2 weeks and talk about more happier times like the Jewish resettlement of the land of Israel, and I look forward to discussing that with you soon. Have a wonderful evening.